The morning Staff Sergeant Alyssa Martinez lost her flight status. The Colorado sky was the color of old steel. She stood in Colonel Brennan's office, dress uniform pressed to regulation perfection, watching him sign the paperwork that would ground her indefinitely. Outside the window, F-16 screamed across the tarmac in perfect formation, the kind of precision she'd once commanded from the cockpit of her HH-60G Pave Hawk. "Effective immediately," Brennan said without looking up, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who'd never pulled bleeding soldiers from a hot LZ. "You're reassigned to administrative duties pending review." Alyssa's jaw tightened. 3 months ago, she'd been the most decorated rescue pilot at Peterson Air Force Base. 2 Purple Hearts, a distinguished flying cross, and more successful combat rescues than any pilot in her squadron. Now she was being shuffled to a desk because of what Brennan called pattern of insubordination. The truth was simpler and uglier. She'd questioned his decision to abort a rescue mission in Afghanistan. 12 soldiers had been pinned down by enemy fire, calling for immediate medevac. Weather was marginal but flyable. Brennan had called it off, citing unnecessary risk. Those 12 soldiers had waited 8 hours for the storm to clear. 2 didn't make it home. "Sir, with respect," Alyssa began, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest. "My flight record speaks for itself. I've never lost a—" "Your flight record," Brennan interrupted, finally looking up with cold gray eyes, "includes multiple instances of exceeding operational parameters without authorization, flying through weather minimums, taking unnecessary risks." He leaned back in his leather chair, a man comfortable with his power. "The Air Force doesn't need cowboys, Martinez. We need pilots who follow orders." The dismissal in his tone was like a slap. Alyssa had served 2 combat deployments, had pulled more than 40 wounded soldiers from impossible situations. She'd earned her reputation the hard way, through skill and courage, not politics and desk assignments. "I've never disobeyed a direct order, sir." "No, but you've bent plenty of them until they snapped." Brennan stood, signaling the meeting was over. "Report to Major Hendricks in personnel. Your new duties begin tomorrow." As she walked across the base afterward, Alyssa felt the weight of stares from other personnel. Word traveled fast in a tight military community. By evening chow, everyone would know that the woman who'd once landed a damaged Pave Hawk in a sandstorm to save a Delta Force team was now pushing papers in an office. In the hangar, where her helicopter sat covered in protective tarps, she found Captain Jake Morrison, her former crew chief, running diagnostics on another bird. Jake was old-school Air Force, 26 years of service written in the scars on his hands and the gray threading his temples. "I heard about your reassignment," he said without looking up from his clipboard. "Load of bureaucratic bullshit, if you ask me." "Nobody asked you, Jake." But there was no heat in her words. Jake had been with her on some of her most dangerous missions. He knew what she was capable of. "You know what they're saying in the NCO club?" Jake set down his tools and faced her. "That Brennan's gunning for general, and your reputation makes him look bad. Man can't stand having someone under his command who's braver than he is." Alyssa stared at her covered helicopter, remembering the weight of its controls in her hands, the thrum of rotors beating against impossible weather. Doesn't matter what they're saying, orders are orders. But even as she said it, she felt something cold and determined settling in her chest. She'd spent her entire adult life saving people, and now she was being sidelined by a man whose biggest concern was his next promotion. That night, alone in her base quarters, she pulled out her old flight logs and began reading. Each entry told a story of lives saved, of impossible rescues pulled off through skill and determination. She traced her finger over one particular entry from 2 years ago. Weather below minimums, visibility near zero, mission successful, 6 lives recovered. Brennan had written her up for that one too. Called it reckless endangerment. The 6 soldiers she'd saved called it miraculous. As wind rattled her windows and snow began to fall outside, Alyssa Martinez made herself a promise. If the situation ever arose again, if lives hung in the balance while bureaucrats worried about regulations, she wouldn't hesitate. Some things were more important than following orders. She had no idea that promise would be tested sooner than she thought. 3 weeks into her administrative purgatory, Alyssa discovered that being grounded was its own special kind of torture. She spent her days in a windowless office, processing flight schedules for pilots who were cleared to do what she couldn't. Every morning, she heard the helicopters lifting off for training runs and rescue drills, their rotors beating a rhythm. That used to be her heartbeat. Major Lisa Hendricks, her new supervisor, was a by-the-book administrator who'd never flown anything more challenging than a desk chair. She seemed to take particular pleasure in assigning Alyssa the most mundane tasks possible: updating pilot certification records, cross-referencing maintenance schedules, filing incident reports that other people got to live. Martinez, Hendricks called from her office door one Tuesday morning. "I need you to review these training protocols. The new safety guidelines from Washington." The thick manual Hendricks dropped on Alyssa's desk was titled Risk Assessment and Mission Abort Procedures. As she flipped through it, her stomach turned. Page after page of bureaucratic language designed to give commanders more reasons to call off missions, more ways to avoid making the hard decisions that saved lives. At lunch in the base cafeteria, she sat alone, picking at her food while listening to the conversation at the pilot's table. Lieutenant Danny Rodriguez was describing a training scenario from that morning. Weather was getting sketchy, but Martinez would have flown it, he said, lowering his voice. "Remember that rescue she pulled off in that thunderstorm last year? Command said it was impossible, but she—" "Keep it down," interrupted Captain Amy Foster, glancing around nervously. "You know, Brennan's got people listening for that kind of talk." The table went quiet. Alyssa felt their eyes on her, a mixture of sympathy and fear. They respected what she'd done, but they also had careers to protect. She couldn't blame them for being careful. That afternoon, she overheard Hendricks on the phone with someone from headquarters. "No, sir, she's been completely compliant. Model behavior. Maybe too quiet, if you ask me." "Yes, sir. I'll keep monitoring the situation." The paranoia was suffocating. They weren't just grounding her. They were watching her, waiting for any excuse to make the punishment permanent. But it was Jake Morrison who gave her the information. That changed everything. He appeared at her office door near closing time, looking around to make sure they were alone. "You need to see this," he said, sliding a maintenance manual across her desk. It looked innocent enough. Standard helicopter. Repair procedures. The tuck between pages 47 and 48 was a photocopied document that made her blood run cold. It was an internal memo from Colonel Brennan to the Pentagon, dated just 2 weeks after her grounding. In it, he recommended that high-risk personality pilots be systematically identified and removed from combat rescue operations. He used her case as an example, describing her as psychologically unsuited for modern military aviation protocols. The memo went on to suggest that the Air Force needed to embrace a new paradigm of calculated restraint in rescue operations. Better to lose a few soldiers than risk expensive aircraft and train pilots on questionable missions. "Jesus," Alyssa whispered, reading it twice to make sure she understood. "He's using me to justify changing the entire rescue doctrine." "Gets worse," Jake said grimly. "Word is he's already got support from 3 other base commanders. They're calling it the Brennan Protocol. No more rescue attempts in weather below specified minimums. No exceptions, no matter the circumstances." The implications hit her like a physical blow. If Brennan succeeded, How many soldiers would die waiting for conditions to improve? How many rescue pilots would be forced to listen to their radios go silent, knowing they could have made the difference? There's something else, Jake continued. I've been talking to some of the other crew chiefs. Morale is shit right now. Pilots are scared to push limits, even in training. They're second-guessing everything, worried about getting the Martinez treatment. That night, Alyssa walked the perimeter of the base, needing the cold air to clear her head. Snow was falling steadily, and she could see lights on in the operations center, where duty officers monitored weather patterns and emergency frequencies. Once, she'd been part of that world. Now she was an outsider, looking in at the life she'd lost. But as she walked, something crystallized in her mind. Brennan thought he'd broken her by taking away her wings. He thought administrative duty would crush her spirit and make her compliant. He was wrong. She still had her security clearance. She still knew every emergency protocol and radio frequency. And most importantly, she still had friends in the hangar who believed in what rescue pilots were supposed to do. If Brennan wanted a war over the soul of combat rescue, she'd give him one. But she'd fight it smart, using the system's own rules against him. The first thing she needed was documentation, evidence of what the new protocols were really costing. And she knew exactly where to find it. The call came at 0347 hours on a Thursday morning in February. Alyssa woke to her emergency radio crackling to life, the one she wasn't supposed to have anymore, but Jake had forgotten to collect it when she was grounded. Through the static, she heard the words that made her blood freeze. Mayday. Mayday, this is Eagle 6. We have multiple casualties, approximate 6 souls. Grid 42 Sierra Mike. Weather is Jesus visibility 0. We need immediate medevac. She was fully awake instantly, rolling out of bed and grabbing the radio. The transmission was breaking up, but she caught enough to understand. A patrol had hit an IED or ambush in the mountains. 6 soldiers down. Blizzard conditions. The radio crackled again. Command, this is Eagle 6. How copy on medevac request? We've got bleeding here. Urgent surgical. Then Brennan's voice, cold and mechanical. Eagle 6. Negative on immediate medevac. Weather is below operational minimums. Stand by for update in 6 hours when storm system passes. 6 hours? The voice from Eagle 6 was desperate now. Command, we can't wait 6 hours. We've got arterial bleeding, possible internal injuries. These men will die. Eagle 6, you will maintain position and apply first aid. No aircraft will launch until weather improves. Command out. The radio went silent except for static. Alyssa stared at it in horror, imagining 6 soldiers bleeding into the snow while a storm raged around them. In her mind, she could see their faces, young, scared, wondering why help wasn't coming. She threw on her clothes and drove to the base, her Jeep sliding on icy roads. The operations center was buzzing with activity, but she could feel the tension. Everyone knew soldiers were dying out there. Everyone knew a rescue was possible for the right pilot. Through the window, she could see her old Pave Hawk sitting in the hangar, covered but ready. Jake had been maintaining it perfectly, just in case. The thought hit her like lightning. She still had her access codes. The hangar guards knew her. The helicopter was fueled and flight-ready. Martinez. Colonel Brennan's voice behind her was sharp with suspicion. What are you doing here? She turned to face him, seeing the satisfaction in his eyes. He was enjoying this. The power to decide who lived and died. The absolute authority to ground rescue attempts while soldiers bled out in the field. Monitoring. The situation, sir. I heard the emergency call. Then you heard my decision. Weather is non-flyable. No exceptions. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. And don't get any heroic ideas, Martinez. You're grounded. Touch that aircraft, and you'll face court-martial. But as he walked away, Alyssa saw something that made her heart race. On the weather screen, the storm was moving faster than predicted. There was a narrow corridor, maybe 20 minutes, where visibility would improve just enough for an experienced pilot to make it through. 20 minutes. That's all she'd need. Jake appeared beside her as if reading her thoughts. "Hangar. Door controls are on the fritz," he said quietly. "Might take maintenance a while to figure out what's wrong with them. Say, 15 minutes. Jake, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm volunteering." He looked out at the storm, then back at her. "Those boys out there, they're somebody's sons. Hell, Rodriguez has a kid the same age as one of those soldiers. You think he can sleep tonight knowing we let them die over weather reports?" The radio crackled again. Any station. This is Eagle 6. We've lost 2. I repeat, we have 2 Kier. Full remaining. Critical condition. Please advise on medevac." Silence from command. Alyssa closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything she'd worked for, her entire career, hung in the balance. Brennan would destroy her if she took that helicopter. Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, maybe even prison time. But 4 soldiers were dying in the snow. 4 families would get the worst news of their lives unless someone acted. She opened her eyes and looked at Jake. "How long to prep the bird? For you? 5 minutes. Do it." As Jake hurried toward the hangar, Alyssa felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks. Purpose. The administrative desk, the endless paperwork, the suffocating bureaucracy, all of it fell away. She was a rescue pilot again, and soldiers needed her. She pulled out her phone and sent a quick text to her sister in Denver. "If something happens to me, know that I did what I had to do. Love you." Then she deleted the message from her sent folder and walked toward the hangar where her helicopter waited. The storm might kill her. Brennan would certainly try to destroy her. But 4 soldiers weren't going to die on her watch, not while she still had wings to fly. The hangar was dark, except for the pale glow of emergency lighting when Alyssa slipped. Inside, her Pavehawk sat like a sleeping giant, its rotor blades tied down against the wind that howled outside. Jake was already there with 2 other crew members, Sergeant Mike Torres, a medic, and Staff Sergeant Rachel Davis, her former co-pilot who'd been reassigned after Alyssa's grounding. "We're with you," Rachel said simply, pulling on her flight helmet. "Those soldiers out there don't deserve to die because of politics. You know what this means," Alyssa warned them. "Brennan will crucify all of us. Court-martial, prison time, the works." Torres, a quiet man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too much combat, shook his head. "Ma'am, I didn't join the Air Force to let soldiers bleed out while we sit on our hands. My oath was to protect and serve, not to protect and file paperwork." As they ran through pre-flight checks, Jake worked on something she'd never seen before. A small device attached to the radio console. "What's that?" "Insurance," he said with a grim smile. "Flight recorder I've been working on. Everything that happens in this bird gets transmitted real-time to a secure server off base. They can court-martial us, but they can't hide what we do out there." The storm was reaching its peak intensity, but the weather radar showed that narrow corridor of opportunity approaching. 23 minutes of marginally flyable conditions, enough time to reach the soldiers and get them to a field hospital. Rachel powered up the navigation systems while Torres prepped medical equipment. "Grid coordinates are locked in," she reported. "It's going to be tight, but we can make it if we leave in the next 10 minutes. Through the hangar's small window, Alyssa could see lights on in the operations center. Someone was moving around inside, probably Brennan, savoring his power while soldiers died. The thought made her jaw clench. "Martinez," the voice from the hangar door made them all freeze. Major Hendricks stood silhouetted against the pale light from outside, her face unreadable. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Hendricks stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Hangar security cameras have been experiencing technical difficulties for the past hour, she said quietly. Might take maintenance all night to fix them. Alyssa stared at her administrative supervisor in shock. Lisa, you could lose your commission over this. I could lose my soul if I don't. Hendricks pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Alyssa. Flight plans, updated weather data, and emergency frequencies. Everything you need to make this official after the fact. After the fact? Emergency Rescue Doctrine, Paragraph 47C. Any qualified pilot may initiate rescue operations during communication blackouts or when command structure is compromised. Hendricks smiled grimly. Radio equipment has been having problems all night. Amazing how these technical failures happen during storms. As if on cue, the base's communication system crackled with static, then went silent. Hendricks had somehow managed to create the perfect cover story, a communication breakdown that justified independent action. Jake finished the pre-flight inspection and gave Alyssa a thumbs up. Birds ready. Weather window opens in 6 minutes. Torres climbed into the cargo bay with his medical gear while Rachel took the co-pilot's seat. As Alyssa strapped herself in, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. But this time, it felt different. This wasn't just about saving 4 soldiers. It was about proving that some things mattered more than following orders. The radio crackled one more time. Eagle 6 to any station. Losing them fast here. Please, somebody? Alyssa keyed her microphone. Eagle 6, this is Rescue 1. En route to your position. Hang tight. We're coming for you. The surprise in the soldier's voice was palpable. Rescue 1. Thought no birds were flying tonight. Sometimes the weather reports are wrong, Alyssa replied, firing up the engines. Give me a strobe if you can. We'll find you. As the rotors began to turn, she saw a figure standing in the operations center window. Even from this distance, she could make out Brennan's silhouette, watching in what she imagined was growing horror as an unauthorized aircraft prepared for takeoff. A radio exploded with angry voices. Rescue 1, this is Base Command. You are not cleared for takeoff. Stand down immediately. She switched off the command frequency and looked at her crew. Last chance to walk away. None of them moved. All right then. Alyssa pulled pitch, and the Pavehawk lifted off into the storm. Let's go save some lives. Behind them, the base erupted in chaos. But ahead, somewhere in the blinding snow and darkness, 4 American soldiers were counting on them to do the impossible. And Alyssa Martinez had never been one to back down from impossible. The moment they cleared the hangar, the storm hit them like a living thing. Wind shear slammed. The Pavehawk sideways, and Alyssa fought the controls as ice began forming on the windscreen faster than the defrosters could clear it. Visibility dropped to less than 50 feet, turning the world into a gray-white void where up and down lost all meaning. Jesus, Rachel breathed, gripping her seat as the helicopter bucked through another wind gust. I can't see anything on. Instruments. GPS is getting scattered by the storm. Flying by feel now, Alyssa replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She'd done this before, flown through impossible weather using nothing but instinct and 20 years of experience. The helicopter was an extension of her body, every vibration and shift telling her something about the air currents and terrain. Below, behind them, the radio erupted with increasingly frantic calls from Base Command. Brennan's voice cut through the static. Rescue 1, you are in violation of direct orders. Return to base immediately or face court-martial. Torres leaned forward from the cargo bay. Want me to shut that off? Leave it, Alyssa said. Let them talk. They're about to eat their words. The storm was worse than the weather reports had indicated. What was supposed to be a 20-minute window of flyable conditions had collapsed to maybe 10 minutes of barely controlled flight. Ice was building up on the rotor blades, creating dangerous vibrations that threatened to tear the aircraft apart. "There," Rachel pointed through the swirling snow. "I see something." 2 o'clock, about half a mile. A weak strobe light flickered through the storm, the signal from Eagle 6. But as they approached, Alyssa could see the nightmare they were flying into. The patrol had been ambushed in a narrow valley, with steep rock walls on both sides. Landing would be nearly impossible in good weather. In this storm, it was suicidal. "Rescue 1. This is Eagle 6. The voice on the radio was weak, desperate. "We see you, but Christ, there's no place to land. It's all rocks and ice." Alyssa studied the terrain through her night vision. The soldier was right. There was no proper landing zone. But about 200 meters up the slope, she could see a small clearing barely large enough for the helicopter's footprint. "Eagle 6, can you move your casualties to grid reference?" She rattled off coordinates for the clearing. "It's going to be a hot extraction. Get them ready to move fast." "Roger. Rescue 1. Give us 5 minutes." While the soldiers moved their wounded, Alyssa circled the area, studying wind patterns and looking for the safest approach. The clearing was on a steep slope surrounded by trees and rocks. One mistake would send them tumbling down the mountainside. "This is insane," Rachel muttered, but there was admiration in her voice. "Only you would attempt a landing like this." "Sometimes insane is what it takes," Alyssa replied, beginning her approach. The landing was pure artistry and desperation combined. Fighting crosswinds that tried to slam them into the trees, she brought the Pavehawk down at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, using the slope itself to help cushion their descent. The helicopter's skids touched down on the edge of the clearing with less than 3 feet to spare on either side. "We're down," she called out. "Torres, go!" The medic was already moving, leaping from the cargo bay into knee-deep snow. Rachel stayed at the controls, ready to lift off at the first sign of trouble, while Alyssa watched the instruments and listened to the sounds of their helicopter protesting against the storm. Through the swirling snow, she could see shapes moving. Toward them, soldiers carrying stretchers, stumbling through the drifts with their wounded comrades. Torres was already at work, his medical training taking over as he assessed injuries and prepared the casualties for transport. 4 wounded, 2 critical. Torres reported over the intercom. "We need to get them to a trauma center fast." But as the soldiers loaded their wounded into the cargo bay, Alyssa heard something that made her blood freeze, the distinctive whine of incoming mortar. The ambush wasn't over. Whoever had attacked the patrol was still out there, and they'd seen the rescue helicopter. "Incoming!" someone shouted. The first mortar round exploded 50 meters away, sending up a geyser of snow and rock. The second was closer, close enough to shower the helicopter with debris. "We need to go now," Rachel yelled. But Torres wasn't finished loading the wounded. 2 soldiers were still outside, struggling to get their most critically injured teammate into the cargo bay. Another mortar round screamed overhead, this one so close that shrapnel pinged off the helicopter's armor. Alyssa made the hardest decision of her career. Instead of lifting off to safety, she kept the helicopter on the ground, rotors turning, while her crew completed the rescue. Every second they stayed increased the risk of being hit, but she wouldn't leave wounded soldiers behind. "Last one aboard," Torres called out. Alyssa pulled pitch, and the Pavehawk clawed its way into the air just as another mortar round hit exactly where they'd been sitting. The explosion rocked the helicopter, but they were climbing, fighting their way through the storm with 4 wounded soldiers in the back. As they flew toward the base hospital, Alyssa allowed herself one moment of satisfaction. They'd done it. They'd save lives when everyone else said it was impossible. But she also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Brennan would be waiting for them with handcuffs and court-martial papers. The landing at Peterson Air Force Base was surreal. As the Pavehawk touched down on the medical pad, Alyssa could see emergency vehicles racing toward them, not just ambulances, but security police with their red and blue lights flashing. Brennan wasn't wasting any time. Torres and the medical team worked frantically to get the wounded soldiers to the trauma center. Through the cargo bay, Alyssa could see one of the rescued soldiers, barely 18 years old, with a shattered leg and blood-soaked bandages, looking back at her with tears in his eyes. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," before the stretcher disappeared into the hospital. That image would stay with her through everything that followed. "Sergeant Martinez, step out of the aircraft immediately." Colonel Brunn's voice cut through the rotor noise like a blade. He stood 20 feet away, flanked by 2 security policemen, his face a mask of controlled rage. Alyssa shut down the engines and climbed out of the cockpit, her flight suit still dripping with melted snow. Around the landing pad, she could see other personnel watching: mechanics, medics, pilots who'd heard about the unauthorized rescue. Their faces were unreadable, but she caught a few nods of respect. "You are under arrest for willful disobedience of orders, unauthorized use of military aircraft, and endangering the lives of your crew," Brennan announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You will be confined to quarters pending court-martial proceedings." As the security police moved to handcuff her, Jake stepped forward. "Sir, if I may." He held up a thick folder. "Flight recorder data from the mission. Everything that happened out there is documented." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "Hand that over immediately." "Already transmitted to Air Force Safety Center, sir," Jake replied smoothly. "Standard procedure for emergency rescue operations. They'll want to review it as part of their investigation." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Brennan's face. He'd been planning to control the narrative, but Jake had just made that impossible. The flight data would show exactly what happened. 4 soldiers saved from certain death by a crew willing to risk everything. "This changes nothing," Brennan snapped. "Martinez disobeyed direct orders. The circumstances are irrelevant." But even as he said it, Alyssa could see doubt creeping into his expression. Around the landing pad, more personnel were gathering. Word was spreading fast about the successful rescue, and the crowd wasn't looking at her like a criminal. Lieutenant Rodriguez pushed through the crowd, his young face flushed with excitement. "Ma'am, I just heard from the hospital. All 4 soldiers are stable. The doctor said if you'd waited even another hour." "That's enough," Brennan barked. "Disperse this crowd immediately." But nobody moved. Instead, more people kept arriving. Pilots from other squadrons, maintenance crews, even some of the administrative staff. They weren't causing trouble, just standing there in silent support. Major Hendricks appeared at Alyssa's side, her administrative uniform looking out of place among all the flight suits. "Colonel, I need to inform you that I've documented several procedural irregularities in tonight's events." "What kind of irregularities?" "Communication systems failures that prevented proper coordination with rescue assets. Weather data that was incorrectly analyzed. Emergency protocols that weren't followed." Hendricks handed him another folder. "I'm recommending a full investigation into base operations procedures." Alyssa watched Brennan's face grow redder as he realized what was happening. His subordinates weren't just defending her. They were building a case that would put his own decisions under scrutiny. "Get her out of here," he ordered the security police. As they escorted her toward the detention facility, Alyssa heard someone start clapping. She turned to see Torres, still in his blood-stained medical gear, applauding. Slowly, one by one, others joined in. Soon the entire crowd was applauding, not wildly or dramatically, but with steady, respectful appreciation. Brennan stood alone in the middle of it, his authority crumbling around him. Later that night, confined to a small room in the security building, Alyssa sat on a narrow cot and reflected on what she'd done. Through the barred window, she could see lights on throughout the base. People were talking, sharing the story of the unauthorized rescue. Social media was probably lighting up with posts from family members of the crew. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A young security policeman entered, looking nervous. "Ma'am, you have a visitor. Says it's urgent." To her surprise, it was Rachel Davis, still in her flight suit. The guard stepped outside to give them privacy. "I wanted you to know," Rachel said quietly. "Word is getting out beyond the base. Someone leaked the flight recorder audio to the media." The whole conversation, Brennan refusing to authorize the rescue, the soldiers calling for help, you deciding to launch anyway. Alyssa felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold room. Media attention is the last thing I need. Right now. Maybe not. Rachel leaned closer. "I just got off the phone with my husband. He works for Channel 7 in Denver. They're calling you a hero. Pilot defies orders to save dying soldiers is going to be tomorrow's headline." Outside, the storm that had nearly killed them all was finally clearing. But Alyssa could feel a different kind of storm building, one that would either destroy her career completely or force the air. Forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about courage and command. Either way, there was no going back now. By morning, the story had exploded across every major news network. Someone had leaked not just the flight recorder audio, but also the internal memo where Brennan had called for grounding high-risk personality pilots. The contrast was devastating. A colonel worried about his career while soldiers bled in the snow, and a grounded pilot who risked everything to save them. Alyssa watched the coverage from her detention room on a small television the guard had smuggled in. CNN was running the headline, "Grounded Hero Defies Orders to Save Lives." Fox News called it, "The Pilot They Couldn't Keep Down." Even international outlets were picking up the story. The interview that changed everything aired on NBC Nightly News. Private First Class Marcus Webb, one of the soldiers she'd rescued, spoke from his hospital bed with tears streaming down his face. "I was dying out there," he said, his voice breaking. "We all were. Command told us to wait, but Sergeant Martinez, she didn't wait. She came for us when nobody else would. She saved my life, and I'll never forget that." The reporter asked about the controversy surrounding the rescue. Webb's response went viral within hours. "Anyone who thinks she did something wrong doesn't understand what it means to be a soldier. We don't leave people behind." She remembered that when the people in charge forgot it, the public reaction was overwhelming. Hashtag Save Sergeant Martinez started trending on Twitter. Veterans groups across the country issued statements of support. The Air Force's Public Affairs Office was flooded with calls demanding her release. More damaging to Brennan were the other stories that started emerging. Jake Morrison had quietly been documenting problems with the colonel's leadership for months. Maintenance records showing helicopters grounded unnecessarily, training missions canceled for minor weather issues. A culture of risk aversion that was making pilots afraid to do their jobs. The breaking point came when Captain Amy Foster, the same pilot who'd been afraid to speak up in the cafeteria, went public with her own story. In a televised interview, she revealed that Brennan had threatened her career after she'd questioned one of his decisions. "He created an atmosphere of fear," she said. "Pilots were scared to speak up, scared to take necessary risks." Sergeant Martinez was the only one brave enough to stand up to him, and he destroyed her for it. Inside the base, the mood was shifting dramatically. What had started as quiet support for Alyssa was becoming open rebellion against Brennan's leadership. Pilots were refusing voluntary missions. Maintenance crews were working at minimum pace. The entire rescue squadron was effectively in revolt. General Patricia Hayes, the base commander, arrived unannounced on the third day of Alyssa's detention. A decorated pilot herself with combat experience in Iraq and Afghanistan, Hayes had a reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense. She visited Alyssa in her detention cell personally, an almost unprecedented gesture. "Sergeant Martinez," Hayes said, sitting across from her at a small metal table. "You've caused quite a stir." "Yes, ma'am. I accept full responsibility for my actions." Hayes studied her for a long moment. "4 soldiers are alive because of what you did. Their families get to hug them again. That counts for something in my book." "But I disobeyed orders, ma'am." "Yes, you did." Hayes leaned back in her chair. "The question is whether those orders were lawful and reasonable." I'd been reviewing Colonel Brennan's command decisions over the past year. Some concerning patterns have emerged. She slid a folder across the table. "That's your personnel file. Every commendation, every citation, every life you've saved. It makes for impressive reading." Alyssa opened the file cautiously. Inside, she found something unexpected. Letters of support from families of soldiers she'd rescued over the years. Dozens of them, all forwarded to the Pentagon over the past 3 days. The Secretary of the Air Force has been getting calls from senators, congressmen, and Gold Star families, Hayes continued. "Turns out you've made quite an impression on people whose opinions matter in Washington." Through the small window of the detention room, Alyssa could see protesters gathering outside the base gates. Veterans in uniform, families holding signs, reading "Free Our Hero" and "Martinez Saved Our Son." "Ma'am, what happens now?" Hayes stood up, her expression unreadable. "Now?" "Now we find out whether the Air Force still remembers what courage looks like." That afternoon, everything changed. General Hayes called an emergency meeting of all base personnel in the main hangar. Word spread quickly that something big was happening. By 1500 hours, nearly 1,000 airmen had gathered, with Colonel Brennan standing stiffly at the front. Hayes took the podium with the bearing of someone who'd made hard decisions in combat zones. 3 nights ago, 6 American soldiers were trapped in a blizzard, bleeding and dying. One pilot chose to risk everything to save them. Today, I'm here to tell you what that means for this base and this command. She gestured to the crowd. "Look around you. These are the men and women who volunteered to serve their country, to put their lives on the line for something bigger than themselves. They deserve leaders who remember that our mission isn't to avoid risk, it's to save lives." The hangar was dead silent. Even Brennan seemed to sense what was coming. Effective immediately, Colonel Brennan is relieved of command pending a full investigation into operational procedures at this base. The announcement hit like a thunderclap. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Williams will assume temporary command. Brennan's face went white. "General, I protest this action. My decisions were based on sound operational. Your decisions," Hayes cut him off, "were based on career preservation rather than mission accomplishment. The investigation will determine whether they constitute dereliction of duty." She turned back to the crowd. "As for Sergeant Martinez, all charges are hereby dropped. She will be restored to full flight status immediately." The hangar erupted. Cheers, applause, and whistles echoed off the metal walls. Alyssa, who had been escorted in for the announcement, felt tears streaming down her face as her squadron surrounded her. Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, grinning from ear to ear. "Told you the truth would come out," he said, clapping her on the shoulder. But the biggest surprise came when Lieutenant Colonel Williams approached her. "Sergeant Martinez, The Air Force needs leaders who understand what service really means. How would you feel about a promotion to flight instructor? We need someone to teach the next generation of pilots what courage looks like. As the celebration continued around her, Alyssa looked up at the American flag hanging from the hangar ceiling. She thought about the 4 soldiers recovering in the hospital, about the families who would have their sons and daughters home for Christmas, about the principle that had guided her entire career. No one gets left behind. Outside, the storm had passed completely. The sky was clear and blue, perfect flying weather. 6 months later, Captain Alyssa Martinez stood in front of her advanced combat rescue class, watching 24 young pilots absorb every word of her lecture on emergency decision-making. The promotion had come with the new assignment. She was now the senior instructor for the Air Force's elite rescue pilot training program. Who can tell me the most important factor in emergency rescue? Operations? She asked. A young lieutenant raised his hand. Weather conditions, ma'am? Wrong. She moved to the whiteboard and wrote 2 words. Moral courage. Technical skills will get you airborne. Weather knowledge will keep you alive. But moral courage, the willingness to do what's right when everyone else tells you it's wrong, that's what separates rescuers from bus drivers. She clicked to the next slide, showing footage from that night in the blizzard. The class had seen it before, but they never grew tired of watching the impossible rescue that had changed everything. Notice the decision point here, she said, pausing the video as the Pavehawk lifted off into the storm. This isn't about breaking rules. This is about understanding that sometimes the mission transcends the protocol. After class, she walked to her office in the training building. The walls were covered with photos from her career. Helicopters in combat zones, rescue crews, and most prominently, a picture of the 4 soldiers she'd pulled from that mountainside. Marcus Webb had sent it to her after his recovery, along with a letter that sat framed on her desk. The letter was simple. Captain Martinez, you taught me that heroes aren't the people who never feel fear. They're the people who feel it and fly anyway. Thank you for showing me what courage looks like. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Jake Morrison entered, now wearing Master Sergeant stripes and serving as her senior enlisted advisor in the training program. Ma'am, got the latest class evaluations. These kids are different from the ones we used to see. She looked at the reports. Flight performance was up across the board, but more importantly, the pilots were showing initiative and confidence that had been missing from recent graduates. They're not afraid to push limits when it matters, Jake continued. Word about what happened here has spread through the entire pilot training pipeline. They're coming in with a different mindset. That was the real victory, Alyssa realized. Not the media attention or the personal vindication, but the cultural change she'd helped create. Young pilots were learning that following orders and serving the mission weren't always the same thing. Her computer chimed with an incoming message. It was from General Hayes, now serving at the Pentagon. Alyssa, thought you'd want to know. The Martinez Protocol has been officially adopted Air Force-wide. Pilots now have explicit authority to initiate emergency rescues during communication failures or when lives are in immediate danger. Your courage saved more than 4 soldiers. It saved the soul of combat rescue. Well done. Patricia. Later that evening, Alyssa stood on the observation deck where she'd once read her reinstatement orders. The sun was setting over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Below her, helicopters were returning from training missions, their pilots confident and skilled. Her phone buzzed with a text from Rachel Davis, now commanding her own rescue squadron. Pulled 3 hikers off Mount Evans today in marginal weather. Thought about you the whole flight. Some things are worth the risk. That night, she pulled out her old flight journal and turned to a fresh page. She wrote the date, then paused, thinking about what she'd learned over the past months. Finally, she wrote, "True leadership isn't about avoiding difficult decisions. It's about making the right choice when the cost is personal and the stakes are someone else's life. The sky doesn't care about our fears or our protocols. It only responds to courage." She closed the journal and looked out her window at the runway lights stretching into the darkness. Somewhere out there, other pilots were facing their own moments of decision. Some would choose safety over service, rules over rescue. But others would remember the night a grounded pilot flew into a blizzard because 4 soldiers needed help. They would remember that some things, honor, duty, the promise that no one gets left behind, matter more than career advancement or following orders. The storm that had tested her was long over, but the legacy of flying through it would endure as long as there were pilots willing to risk everything for the simple principle that every life has value. In her desk drawer, next to Marcus Webb's letter, sat a new piece of correspondence, a request from the Air Force Academy to speak to incoming cadets about leadership and moral courage. She'd already accepted, knowing that somewhere in that audience would be the next generation of pilots, who might one day face their own impossible choice between orders and conscience. The inscription she planned to leave them was simple, borrowed from the patch that General Colmarmick had once pinned to her chest in the snow. "When the storm comes, and the mission calls, and everyone else says wait, remember that heroes aren't the ones who follow orders. Heroes are the ones who save lives." As she turned off her office lights and headed home, Alyssa Martinez smiled. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to teach young pilots that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's flying anyway when someone's life depends on it. The Pavehawk that had carried her through that blizzard still sat in the hangar, now designated as a training aircraft. But more than that, it had become a symbol. Every pilot who trained on it learned the story of the night when rules yielded to righteousness, when protocol surrendered to purpose. And in the end, that was the most important rescue of all, saving the idea that doing right matters more than doing what you're told. The storm had ended. The heroes it created would fly forever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.